theory about why we suffer to begin with. Does Stoicism have something like that?
Yes, the Stoics do have something like that. It's much more similar to the Buddhist variety. That is, for the Stoics, suffering and unhappiness are derived from the fact that we have fundamental misconceptions about the nature of reality. And in particular, we do not take seriously the so-called dichotomy of control, which is that some things are up to us and other things are not up to us, and that we should focus our efforts on the things that actually are under our control. And under our control, it turns out, is only our behavior, our values, and our judgments. Everything else is outside, and you should treat it as a indifferent to your ability to live a good life, a life that is worth living.
So, okay, so I would think, for starters, one thing that Buddhism and Stoicism have in common is an emphasis on maintaining equanimity in the face of circumstances that might be considered adverse.
Correct.
And, you know, in the extreme case, if you become a true kind of master in either realm, basically equanimity under any circumstances whatsoever, right? That's the ideal.
Ideal, that's right. Ideally, yes. Right.
And is there, I gather, there's a kind of, I don't want to say a ranking system, but I mean, just that in Buddhism, there is, you know, there are monks. Well, there are lay people, of course, but then there are monks. And then there are, in theory, people who have attained enlightenment. Now, I gather that in Stoicism, is like sage a formal designation that very few people, well, maybe not formal, but a kind of aspired to level of attainment that very few people reach. Is that right?
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, the figure of the sage in Stoicism is a little bit controversial, even among the ancient Stoics. Some of them said that the sage, or seem to say that the sage is just an ideal. It's not something that anybody can actually reach in their lifetimes. Other people say, you know, somebody can potentially become a sage, but it's a really rare thing. The thing that actually I do like about Stoicism, even, again, beginning with the ancient variety, but also in the modern version, is that, in a sense, to use a Christian way to put it, we're all sinners, we're all imperfect, you know. But so long as we're trying to work on things, we're trying to improve. The term is prokopton, the one who makes progress. So long as we're trying to do that, that's really the goal. As Seneca famously put it, it's like I'm not aiming at being perfect. I'm aiming at being better than yesterday.
Now that leads to a question. I mean, first of all, I would say there's very much a similar kind of argument at least in Western Buddhism. I mean, in kind of Asian Buddhism, I don't think there's any doubt that enlightenment is in theory attainable. Certainly the Buddha reached it. But in Western Buddhism, there's, you know, people argue like, is anyone truly enlightened? And I've talked to people who consider themselves enlightened, or is it just something you would approach asymptotically and never reach? So you have the same argument there. You mentioned this Christian idea that we're all sinners. One thing Buddhism has in common with Christianity is, you could call it a theory of the nature of being human, if not a theory of human nature, that accounts for this problem. So Christianity has original sin. We inherited the sinfulness of, we inherited something not great that goes all the way to Adam and Eve. Buddhism has something kind of comparable. The idea is you're born with some degree of confusion about the actual nature of reality.
Right.
And liberation will lie in, and just alleviation from suffering, even short of full-fledged liberation, will lie in dispelling the confusion, the ignorance, getting a clearer view of reality. So there's a theory about why we suffer to begin with. Does Stoicism have something like that?
Yes, the Stoics do have something like that. It's much more similar to the Buddhist variety. That is, for the Stoics, suffering and unhappiness are derived from the fact that we have fundamental misconceptions about the nature of reality. And in particular, we do not take seriously the so-called dichotomy of control, which is that some things are up to us and other things are not up to us, and that we should focus our efforts on the things that actually are under our control. And under our control, it turns out, is only our behavior, our values, and our judgments. Everything else is outside, and you should treat it as a indifferent to your ability to live a good life, a life that is worth living. Now, it's not indifferent in the sense that you don't literally care about it. In fact, that's why the Stoics introduced this distinction between preferred and dispreferred indifference, which is a wonderful phrase, you know, oxymoronic phrase, but it does help sort of making a fundamental point, which is certain things you do want to go after, if you can. Those are things like the same things that Aristotle and everybody else will value. Education, wealth, whatever it is. Friends and all that sort of stuff, and other things you want to stay away from as much as possible: poverty, sickness, and so on and so forth. But all of those, both the positive ones and the negative ones, are indifferent, meaning that they are not the things that make your life worth living. Mm-hmm. What makes your life worth living is right judgment and behave, as a person that is a moral, person, and that is concerned about his or her moral integrity. That's what makes your life worth living. If you're gonna go after riches, for instance, or anything else, any positive, preferred, indifferent, and in doing so you compromise your moral integrity, you do bad things in order to get them, then those things are definitely not worthwhile. You should be detached from them. You should really not care about them.
Okay. So the basic distinction between things that are in your control and things that are not is reflected in the Christian serenity prayer, right?
Correct.
God, how does that go? God grant me the courage to change the things I can, serenity to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference?
That's right. And the serenity prayer is actually fairly recent. It was introduced by a theologian in the early part of the 20th century.
It's generally attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr, although I think now there's a little controversy on that.
Yeah, as usual with these things.
Yeah.
But I found in researching it for my book, I actually found that similar sentiments are found also in medieval Jewish philosophy. I believe in Buddhism as well. And certainly Epictetus' version is very similar, and it goes back to the 2nd century.
Yeah, I don't think a big deal is explicitly made of that distinction in Buddhism, in part because the aspiration in Buddhism is so radical. It's just like to be able to be indifferent to all forms of adversity. I mean, there isn't as much emphasis on reaching out and controlling the things you can. I should say that, of course, Buddhism is so diverse and far-flung, and because it has been a living and geographically spreading tradition ever since 2,500 years ago. So there's just all these manifestations of it, and there is, I cannot, with very few exceptions, there's you cannot say much about Buddhism generally. But with that as a caveat, so
let me stop you there for a second. So because when I'm asked by people about the similarities between Stoicism and Buddhism, other than telling them that I don't have expertise in Buddhism, I only read a few things and I talked to a few people like you. But I also tell them that precisely that's one of the major differences in terms of sort of cultural tradition, right? So Stoicism existed in a fairly compact and way between the 3rd century before current era and the 2nd century. The Stoics did disagree among themselves. There were things about which that changed over those 500 years, but not that much. And then there was basically a hiatus of 1.5 millennia or more before modern Stoicism arose. And of course, that makes Stoicism actually a much more compact philosophy and much homogeneous philosophy. When I say it compares with Buddhism, I say but you should think about Buddhism actually as a family of philosophy, or talk about Buddhism in the plural, Buddhisms, because there's a variety of ways of interpreting it, and it has evolved in a number of different ways.
Right, and there's the fact that Buddhism, as lived by most Asians, is a religion with deities and all that stuff, and the version of Buddhism that has come to dominate the United States, or at least gets the most attention, is more secular, naturalistic. It does put a lot of emphasis on the practices,
right?
Meditative practices, and on the philosophy. But for many people, the religion part has dropped out. I mean, now.